Welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we analyze the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in our country. We have discussed the health aspect of the virus and the disease, but now we want to focus on how it is affecting our economy. Will the government of Ecuador put profits over health? And how will we recover economically from the lockdown? To answer that, we have economist Pedro Paez. Thank you, Pedro, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So first, we want to see what has been the impact, the economic impact of COVID-19 for Ecuador.
We must understand the circumstances of this pathetic episode and this contradiction between life and capital that we are living in Ecuador. We have to understand it into the framework of 3 years of a very extremist agenda of neoliberal policies that had already created a depression among some of the most vulnerable segments of the population, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, capitalist and non-capitalist, in the rural area and in the urban area that have been facing negative inflation rates for almost 3 years, facing at the same time very high costs coming from these bottlenecks of oligopolic control, both for imports and from national production, and at the same time final prices falling time and again all the time, creating a situation of debt deflation, an urgent need of indebtedness in order to end the month with the expenditures of the family. When the COVID came to Ecuador and the quarantine restricted even more the conditions of gaining the livelihood of every day, the situation had been catastrophic.
And before we analyze what the latest announcements by the government, we want to look back a bit, because when this just happened, when we just having this lockdown in Ecuador, the government announced a several list of austerity measures, but they haven't been approved yet. How would that work? Would they be approved? Do we need those austerity measures?
The government and the deep state, that includes the American embassy, the banks, the big banks, and the traditional elites coming from a pre-capitalist matrix of monopoly power, had some very monolithic convergence around the most extreme agenda of neoliberalism, hidden behind the gaining of Lenin Moreno as a candidate of the center left. So when the adjustment of accounts with Rafael Correa started, they started to deploy this agenda in every front, in every little front of the public gestion, of the public administration. They deploy their agenda with a lot of audacity. However, the ambitions, the repart of the distribution of the gains of the bounty among these coalitions have been creating endogenous obstacles to the deployment of the agenda. With the attempt to the so-called Prole 4, the omnibus law that included a very, very heavy reforms to a lot of organic laws, and even violating the constitution in order to further the deregulation of the financial markets, the deregulation of the current and the capital account in the balance of payments, and the more extreme labor reform. The circumstances of the popular uprising in October created a condition of further exacerbation of the disputes within this deep state, within this coalition. So they are still trying to deploy, to implement in operative terms, all the reforms not necessarily through the law that was already proposed as an anti-constitutional law, but through minor bylaws and administrative measures in every single aspect and every single front of the economy. More specifically, in terms of taxes, in terms of exoneration of taxes, subsidies to the rich people, social security, labor reform, and the regulation of the financial markets, creating a kind of reservoir of resources in the international reserve in favor of the banks, trying to exonerate them out of their duties to fed the guarantee fund, the liquidity fund, and all the mechanisms that had created a minimum balance in terms of avoiding moral hazard and adverse selection. So the current situation is a kind of impasse among these elites in the distribution of the privatization of the public enterprises and the most important productive assets of the state, and at the same time trying to go as far as they can in every front of the neoliberal agenda.
And now that you've mentioned this neoliberal agenda, now the current government says that the last administration left no money for these situations, for economic situations that need a balance of payment, like a cushion for money that we might need in case of a pandemic, of what we're living in this moment. Is that the case for Ecuador? Are we out of money for taking care of a pandemic in Ecuador?
Well, this is a kind of outrageous claim on behalf of some of the functionaries of the authorities that they had even mentioned the reserves of Canada, or saying that Ecuador should have 80% of the GDP as international reserve in cases of this kind of exogenous shocks. It is impossible. The best type of savings that the country can have is precisely the construction of infrastructure, as it could be proven during the El Niño phenomenon, when Colombia and Peru had very heavy losses, very heavy human losses, and very onerous infrastructure losses, material losses. And Ecuador, due to the infrastructure that has been built during the previous years, during the first years of the Correa government, was able to surmount the situation without any inconvenience. Of course, if you have the perfect storm with the earthquake, the phenomenon El Niño, the very dramatic drop of oil prices, and the aggression, the offensive of the banks, creating a credit crunch situation during the last years of the government, trying to obtain through the manipulation of the markets, through the manipulation of the financial sector and the liquidity of the economy, what they were unable to do it through the popular vote, you have a very difficult situation. Even though the government, the new government received a country in plain recovery, the cycle was getting up to the point in which, again, the offensive of the banks with an exacerbation of the capital flights and the same government policy, the fiscal austerity policy, recreated the conditions of recession, especially against the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. This is a historical inheritance. This is a structural addiction that Ecuador has with respect to the oil revenues, both for the economy as a whole, in more so with the conditions of the dollarization, in which we don't have the cushion of the national currency, but more specifically in terms of the government revenues, the lack of taxation upon the oligarchies, the historical political weakness to tax the oligarchies have created this dependency of the government expenditure and the government intervention on the revenues of oil. Between 40 and 60% of the oil of the government revenues of the budget has been fed by the oil revenues during the last half century. So it indeed is a very sharp problem, the dramatic drop in the prices of oil. But there are some alternatives in terms of the recovery of the economy. The problem is that we are in the middle of this dogmatism, this fundamentalism of markets, on behalf of the whole cabinet, in special of the economic cabinet, that had created conditions unique in have everywhere, even with the most neoliberal governments in both in the north and in the underdeveloped countries, you have stimulus packages trying to confront the crisis. Here in Ecuador, they have deepened the austerity policies, firing public servants, reducing the salaries of the public servants in an unconstitutional measure.
Well, we also saw throughout this month that the government kept announcing several economic stimulus, economic packages for the smaller businesses that will be affected by COVID-19. Do you think those announcements were some kind of sort of trying to cover what they really wanted to do, these austerity programs?
Very, very insufficient. Almost 81% of the families in Ecuador do not have savings enough to meet the month ends. They gain the livelihood. Their livelihood is gained every day, both in terms of wage labor or in terms of small entrepreneurs, small sales in the street, etc., etc. And the same happens with the peasants. The poverty in the rural sector has reached the last figures that were already manipulated about poverty in the rural sector reached 71% of the population. So the situation is really, really extreme. The palliatives have been totally insufficient. Even the bonus that were part of the traditional and very effective policies in terms of emergency had been too little, too late. We need to create another type of policy package that includes, for example, the new technologies of information and communication, like the electronic currency, the digital currency, in order to promote a much agile circulation of money, a much more opportune capillarity in terms of the provision of liquidity to the rural areas, to the provinces, to the populous neighborhoods in Quito, Guayaquil, and the big cities. We need to promote all type of conditions in terms of the platform of the internet, heading to the internet of the things, like what the Superintendency of Market Power Control deployed since 2015 with the Supertienda Ecuador. Is a kind of a software platform in open source, open to any kind of institutions, public or private institutions. That is a kind of fusion between applications like eBay or Trivago or Uber, but put to the disposition to facilitate the business of the small and medium-sized enterprises. You have P2C, that means producer to consumer relationships. You can manage also producer to producer relationships in order to build up the fabric, the productive fabric from the community, from the territory. You have possibilities to G2P relationships between the government and the producers, both at the central level and the local level, and you can build up a new type of associations and consortiums in order to create an alternative channel or alternative networks of supply to the cities that thus far have been concentrated in the big supermarkets and in the big banks. We need to create a new type of relaunching of the economy, but with a very sharp, inclusive horizon.
So, Pedro, do you think then it's necessary for the productive sector, at least a part of it, to go back to work as announced by the government just weeks after we see a surge in the cases of COVID-19 in Ecuador? Is it wise to just go back to normal, or is it just maybe the productive sector is pushing the government to acquire this?
It is a very, very hard decision because, as I mentioned, we have 60% of the economically active population in the informal sector, and 81% of the households depend on the gainings of every day. However, I think it will be irresponsible, criminally irresponsible, to weaken the sanitary measures, prevent the contagion due to the pressures of the big capital. And that is what is all going on now with the decisions of the government. On the contrary, as I mentioned, there are some alternatives in terms of the technologies of information and communication that within the restrictions of mobility and contact that must be continue in order to prevent the already disastrous situation in terms of contagion and fatalities in Ecuador. We could have another type of relaunching of the economy from a popular perspective. Again, you have Supertienda Ecuador, you have dinero electrónico, the digital currency, but not as a monopoly of the banks, but as a public service without profits. We have alternatives like the credit card, the productive credit card by the public bank, in order to reduce costs, 0% interest rates, to reduce transaction costs for the small and medium-sized producers, and to create the conditions of working capital within the framework of the seasonal requirements of production, especially food production in the rural area. We have alternatives in terms of micro insurance for the rural and the urban area for the small and medium-sized enterprises. We have a system of warranties and retro warranties with the support of the state. We could have a public-private endeavor with the private bank that had obtained record profits during the last years. Every single year they overcome the previous gains, the previous profits of the in the midst of a recessionary country, a recessionary economy. So we could have a devolution on behalf of those banks of this favor that the Ecuadorian economy had given them in order to relaunch the economy. And the same happened with the big telephonic enterprises, the providers of internet, for example. We have an important coverage of mobile phones, but the cost of internet services, data especially, is very high, is much higher than in our neighborhood countries like Colombia and Peru, even if they have been served by the same transnationals. So we could have a relaunching program, a package, a coherent and integral package of relaunching of the economy through the technologies of information and communication, with the liberation, with the free data on behalf of these companies and the public company provider of top services in order to cover the most vulnerable, the most fragile segments of the economy and the population.
And that was exactly my next question, because can we ideally believe that a country like Ecuador can depend slowly on these technologies, since thousands of people in Ecuador don't have access to internet, don't have access to a telephone, to a smartphone, to a tablet, to a computer. They can't work from home, because even if the government asks them to stay at home and work from there, they can't. Can we think of another way to achieve it? Because as the statistics shows, we have a lot of people that cannot do that.
is the least dangerous mechanism to do it, and the most easy alternative in terms of government intervention, because there where you don't have the services of internet provision, you can go with a specific intervention of the government that could be solved in few days with the platforms of Supertienda Ecuador and the electronic currency. It is very easy to create conditions of self-organization of the people in order to build up a coherent system of provision and the chains of value outside of the monopolic and oligopolic control of the big supermarkets, the big companies, and the big banks. The lack of coverage of internet is really relative, because you have the ratio of mobile phones to population is more than one. So even in the poorest regions, if you don't have, your household do not have a mobile phone, maybe your neighbor had it. So the possibilities of building up from the territory, from the community, from the neighborhood, alternatives of survival is much more hopeful from this type of horizon than from the horizon of total exclusion and marginalization that has been the norm in the midst of these austerity policies that have precarized wage work, and at the same time has constricted in a very severe way the effective demand, not only for the big companies, but in a cascade effect with the domino effect over the social and popular economy.
And Pedro, for our last question, I don't want to finish this program without asking you about the issue of dollarization. As most people know, Ecuador is under the dollar system. We don't have a currency of our own. How does that affect differently our country than the rest of them? Exactly, specifically because we are seeing a lot of reports of people retrieving a lot of money from their bank accounts here in Ecuador. How would that affect how we see our country in the next year or 5 years? Is the dollarization in any danger?
Unfortunately, this is precisely the part of the agenda. They have created the same elites that profited out of the neoliberal policies during the previous 3 decades, had profited out of the deregulation and the programmed implosion of the financial sector at the end of the 90s. The same elites that profited out of the neoliberal policies, the privatizations, the dollarization itself, now are prone to create the conditions for the explosion of dollarization and to obtain the highest price that they could be able to do it. Part of the pretensions of the Prole 4, the omnibus law that they attempted to approve in last October, was precisely the deregulation that were creating the conditions for tax haven, the most extreme kind of financial paradise, even better for them and for the Colombian mafias, for narco laundry, even better than any of the Caribbean islands that had been burned up by the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. On the contrary, we have to create the conditions for stability, even if we decide sovereignty and democratic procedures to get out of dollarization. There are other alternatives, but because of course dollarization created structural restrictions in terms of the ammunitions that they have in order to respond to the crisis. But in the political economy conditions right now, unfortunately, this is marked by this agenda of predation on behalf of these elites.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Pedro, for your time and for also guiding us through this very interesting and very difficult to understand topic, which is the economy and how it relates to our social life.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. So we were talking to economist Pedro Paez on the impact of COVID-19 on citizens' economies and the state finances, and how Ecuador could stay afloat during these difficult times. We have to stay positive, of course. Thank you for watching. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.